Within the first chapter of Gabriela and His Grace by Liana de la Rosa, we get at least 3 references to Sebastian, our hero's glasses, with an adjective that I don't think I can use at the very beginning of a YouTube video, which I like to think was for me personally. So let's go ahead and dive in to the finale to the Luna Sisters series, Gabriela and His Grace, where we are following the youngest of the Luna sisters that we have been following now for 2 previous books, Anna Maria and the Fox and Isabel and the Rogue, both of which we have previously talked about on this channel. And in some ways we're kind of coming full circle because we first meet the Luna sisters on a boat over to England from Mexico as they are fleeing the French occupation and working to build alliances in England under the care of their uncle, who is the Mexican ambassador. And we start with Gabriela and His Grace at the boat again, or at a boat again, as Gabriela is anticipating or getting ready to sail back to Mexico as the conflict is starting to wind down and there is victory on the horizon. And this is kind of tough for Gabby as Mexico feels like home and she anticipates going home and this return of something, while also recognizing the freedom that England has offered her and the way that she's been able to bloom, and she kind of fears that becoming suppressed or what her father's reaction is going to be, to the point where she hasn't even told her parents that she is coming. She is going to go stay with Isabel and Sirius. And so she is preparing to board the boat and saying her goodbyes to Anna Maria and Gideon and their young daughter when she discovers that there is going to be a companion on this trip that she was not anticipating, namely Sebastian, also known as the Duke of Whitfield and one of Gideon's best friends and one of Gabby's biggest enemies of sorts. They have had a contentious relationship prior to this moment, to the point where both of them are dreading this trip, even as Gideon has kind of gotten Sebastian to agree to look over Gabby en route. And Sebastian is going to Mexico to kind of look at a mine he has invested in, and this mine, kind of returning back to the mines that we were just at in last week's book as well, very different tonally, but this mine is offering opportunities to kind of refill the coffers of his estate, and there is a lot of drama and backstory there for him in terms of his father having very purposefully bankrupted the title. And so this is Sebastian's way to make good for those under his care without having to marry an heiress for the sake of a dowry. And so these 2 rivals, these 2 enemies, if you will, find themselves on a boat to Mexico, and there the journey just begins. But before we dive all the way in, hi, my name is Melody, and we talk about books and book adjacent things on this channel, including ideally every Friday, digging deeper into a specific title. And if that sounds up your alley, go ahead and like and subscribe, and I would love for you to hang out a little longer. And with that, let's return to these 2 whose story I have been anticipating for quite a while, as we have seen them dancing, kind of figuratively, because Gabby gave Sebastian the cut direct in a ballroom and refused to dance with him, but dancing figuratively nonetheless around each other for years at the point of this narrative, because it is mentioned offhand that Gabby has been in England for 4 years. And so there is a lot of backstory going on between these 2 just at the beginning, and it's referenced, and that adversarial relationship is referenced at the beginning, but like with the other 2 books, we do rely a little bit on being given that information, and we will dig into this a little bit more. But we kind of have to go in knowing that to a certain extent. You can absolutely read this on its own first, but especially with this series, I do think you benefit from having read the other books, especially as Anna Maria and Isabel are very present in Gabby's journey, both in England and Mexico, within different parts of her story and this kind of journey to herself and to love that she's on, which I think is actually a kind of underrated secondary love story over the course of the series, because when we meet these sisters, they have been raised in a kind of adversarial relationship themselves and have been pit against each other by especially their father. And so going over to England, they weren't particularly close. And so this kind of journey over the past 4 years or so has brought them closer, and we get to see that closeness reflected in Gabby's journey here in the way that she interacts with her sisters, and that was really beautiful to see. But we are also then seeing this adversarial and snarky relationship between her and Sebastian reflected in a way where we have to kind of buy into it. And it's established by both characters in their points of view that they have this relationship, but we don't see it as much. We do see a flashback to the first or the start of the tension in this relationship that is particularly steamy, in which Gabby has had at her first ball kind of wandered away from the ballroom and stumbled upon Sebastian in midst of certain activities where eye contact was made. And this sets up a really kind of steamy moment that I don't know if this was ever actually grappled with or fully realized in kind of reckoning with the history of these two characters. And we have this kind of ability to meet each other and the breadth of these two characters that, again, I feel like we are told a lot more than we get to see realized, unfortunately, in some ways. At the same time, this book was exactly what I needed right now. It is a stressful time in Chicago. I've got some resources down below related to that, and this was the perfect kind of escape. But like with Anna Maria and Isabel, I felt the opportunity to kind of push further. And I think this comes down to the way character was handled in this and the characterizations of Gabby and Sebastian and the plotting and action, or lack thereof, in relation to the stakes of the novel, especially in wake of two novels where we are really kind of working or following heroines that are fighting for the political future of their country. And here we have a heroine who's kind of trying to figure out where her home is. And she's also kind of reckoning with herself and how she is perceived by the world and where her power lies. And Gabby has always been prized for her beauty and kind of what she can get others in relation to that as well, whether it be her father and his political machinations, or she is partly fleeing London because of a scandal in which a man tried to corner her and compromise her in order to gain her dowry. And so she's been a pawn in these games, even as we are exploring this idea that she is more than just a pretty face. And this has been her main kind of internal conflict, even as this book kind of reckons with the power that she has had, or at least Sebastian speaks to the power that she has wielded as a representative and an ambassador for Mexico abroad, and the way that she has presented herself and represented her country, being a kind of use of these things that she has kind of seen as a weakness, or as people not recognizing her full potential or seeing her in her totality, but also kind of seeing the strength that that offers her as well. But this idea at the heart of it, as with most romance novels, right, that your couple sees through to the truth of the other, which is why the snarky relationship between these two is so important and works to some level, even as it's kind of pared back here. But this idea that Gabby can kind of let loose and be herself around Sebastian. She is not the prim and proper kind of poised society lady kind of aiming to be a representative of whatever. She gets to be herself and uses blunter language, calls him on whatever. And so there is that kind of tension there. However, at the same time, we don't really get the opportunity to explore who Gabby is beyond how she's perceived by others, other than like references to her charity work in London, which is great. But again, we kind of fall into this trap that we sometimes, or I've kind of noticed across the series, where we have these really engaging characters, really interesting characters, and I can see the internal conflicts especially built up around these characters, especially in relation to their larger or wider circumstances. Because here it could be argued that Gabby is partially having this kind of crisis of identity and what her future is going to look like, because we are seeing kind of like the waning down of this major conflict that has been kind of guiding the last period of her life, and kind of reckoning or facing down what her future looks like in face of that, and it is looking like her father marrying her off for his own political ambitions and to kind of secure the new political kind of norm in Mexico, and her realizing that that is not in fact what she wants, and she doesn't want to be sitting across from her father for the rest of her life listening to him put her down. And so we watch a Gabby who is in kind of flight mode for most of the book. She is running away from England, she runs from other things over the course of the book, and so she's having to find herself amidst this wider world. However, again, we're being told a lot of this about Gabby, whether through her point of view or whether through the narrative more generally and directly. And this sometimes comes through via dialogue, again, sometimes through just the general narrative. And we're going to swing back to that and Gabby and how all of that works, but I want to swing over to Sebastian for a little bit as well, because we do establish him, again, kind of being told as such that he is a rake. And we have that moment at the beginning of the novel where we're told he is a rake through that flashback, which, again, great flashback. But at the same time, we never really see him as a rake over the course of the book. This could be a larger trend where I've heard some historical romance authors comment on the fact that publishers are kind of reining them in on allowing their rakish characters to be rakish on page, which I think is holding things back a little bit. We talk a lot, or I talk a lot, about the kind of emotional messiness or kind of pulling our punches on the emotional weight of some of these journeys. And I unfortunately do think that we are seeing that to a certain extent here. There are some really delicious moments, but we never fully, it feels like, grapple with the way that these characterizations are layered within the internal and external journeys in a way that allow us to feel the fullness of that. And in fact, we kind of shift pretty abruptly in the third act in a way that feels kind of disconnected from the rest of the emotional journey. Was I still having a great time? Yes. However, I recognize that we had the opportunity to really push this to the next level in a way that would have utterly wrecked me and left this as one of my favorite books. And I just wanted that to be realized because I could see it just right there, just right over the horizon, and we didn't fully get there. And so we have, with Sebastian, a character who is supposed to be this rakish character, slutty glasses, and yet it's kind of, we again have to kind of trust the archetypes, like I mentioned with Isabel to a certain extent. And also we have this incredible amount of privilege with Sebastian, with his title. And does he have complicated relationships with that title in relation to his father? Absolutely. But at the same time, he has this amount of privilege that he doesn't even fully recognize. He talks about having not voted his seat in the House of Lords, and especially if we're looking at this series as a political exploration and the incredibly high political stakes for all of the Luna sisters especially, I think that that in particular is something that really needs to be reckoned with, and we have a brief reference to it toward the end after we've had this kind of emotional connection. However, it's kind of a throwaway in a way where it feels like it just has to be reconciled or mentioned, but it's not actually emotionally grappled with. Additionally, there is a line early on that says, "I've never known you to respect a woman before." And I went, oh, okay, so we have this like rake hell that is being established, but is also kind of emotionally distant from that. He's like a little softer at the same time in his presentation, and so he's not really allowed to be a full cad in a way that makes a reversal of some of that with Gabby kind of hit harder. And at the same time, we have some things set up that I don't know, it's not really Chekhov's gun because we attempt to pick it up, but I don't know that we fully do. But I was so waiting for it to be picked up. We have a line early in the book where it says, "That's why you keep me around. You like it when people stand up to you. They so rarely do." Which to me was such clear foreshadowing to Sebastian and Gabby's relationship. And I mean, it is still. It's this idea that Gabby is the one that will stand up to him, and that is why he is attracted to her. And this idea that she is the one, or he is the one that she can stand up to, that she is allowed to be herself around. Because we talk, or the narrative talks about this kind of dimming that he witnesses in her when she gets to her parents and her father's estate, and kind of watching that. And so that was, again, kind of, for me, a very obvious foreshadowing to some more intimate relations and dynamics that I thought would play out. That there's one scene where Spanish was utilized in a really great way that kind of alluded to Gabby kind of taking control in the moment, but I think that it would have been real interesting if Gabby was the more dominant presence in the more intimate relations between the two of them in wake of that, and kind of playing with these roles that both of them are playing in public versus private, especially as his verbal sparring with Gabby is kind of like what causes him to look at things he may have taken for granted, though some of the emotional reveals and reversals of his perspective and his outlook and how he views Gabby, even, the kind of impetus of that isn't fully clear. And again, I think a lot, because the pieces, you can see how compelling these pieces are. And again, when you're caught up in the moment, you're enjoying it. However, where I think that some of the connective tissue was lost, or what the kind of problem was in realizing all of that great potential, or where things kind of were set up that weren't fully realized, was in the lack of action over the course of the book. And I think that this is a little different. I think it ties back into some of the common critiques I've had across all of the books in relation to some of the information being given kind of bluntly rather than through action, show versus tell at its most basic kind of distillation. But with Anna Maria, I had some comments or critiques of the pacing of that book in particular. And part of that also may have been the way it was marketed in relation to the story and how it was paced. But I remember having some pacing issues with that. And here, I think it's different than pacing, though pacing does come into it. The kind of emotional brunt is really faced in the back third of the book. And again, we do see some much different conflicts in relation to that emotional revelation. We see a much different third act breakup than I was expecting, or third act crisis, I should say, because again, it's Gabby kind of fleeing and then having to make the decision on whether she's going to keep fleeing forever. But with the prior two books, we again have these very high political stakes for these two characters, or four characters, or everyone really, and there is some action that is going on. And here we have a much more internal kind of conflict, and again, an internal conflict where it was possible for it to be realized in the external in a way that I don't know that it fully succeeded in, even if I think that may have been the intent. And I think this ties back to my comment again that the fullness of the emotional weight wasn't fully realized, especially if we're looking at this on its face as an enemies to lovers kind of story. Where is the reversal of the conflict? Do we really see these characters in conflict in this book? I don't think so. I think the first thirdish of the book, when they're going to Mexico, we have kind of set up as the reevaluation of these two, or the kind of forced proximity of the boat, forcing them to interact in ways they may not have previously, and kind of reevaluate each other, or see each other in new light. And then we have them going to Mexico, discovering that they are going to be sharing a residence with Isabel and Sirius in Mexico, and the kind of recalibration of that as, you know, Gabby is also looking at this new world around her and facing down her future, and the politics of that in wake of the relationship with her father. But there's no real drive or narrative drive there. Like, what is driving these characters? It's more kind of circumstantial. They're on the boat together, and then they're in Mexico together because of the circumstances. And so it feels very reactive in a way, but reactive in a way where they're not really taking control of their circumstances. And there are these bright little moments, like the ball or a party that's being thrown in Mexico, where Gabby's father is kind of speaking down on her in mixed company in a ballroom, and Sebastian ends up standing up for her in wake of this, even as she inevitably overhears her father. This is my kind of set down scene. She had one in Anna Maria, she had one in Isabel, and they are inevitably my favorite scene, generally, of the book. And this may have been no different, even if I think that the emotional punch of it could have hit harder, even within the kind of face-off between Gabby and her father, because we were kind of coming back into this political situation where, as a reader, we weren't given the full kind of scope of it. We were again told where things were laying at the given moment, and we were told that Gabby was going to get married off potentially to a peninsular in order to kind of consolidate power for her father, but we weren't allowed to feel the emotional stakes of that as actively, and Gabby didn't have anything that she was working toward within her own kind of arc or journey that was guiding that. And so it felt, again, like we were reactive. And I hesitate to use that as a critique because I don't think there's anything wrong with characters reacting to things, but rather that the stakes felt much lower here because it wasn't clear what either of these characters were necessarily working toward. Like, yes, the future is very high stakes for Gabby, but as a reader, we need to feel that differently in the moment and within the plotting of the novel. It's not simply being told that. And so that left some of the plotting feeling a little bit contrived, even if moments of it were incredibly satisfying, because again, Liana de la Rosa's voice is great. There are just these moments where I wish it would push just a little further within the kind of full scope of things. And so we really pick up on the emotional intimacy and physical intimacy in the last third of the book. And so it felt like a little bit like we were spinning our wheels in the first half, which was unfortunate because I really liked the time that we got to spend in Mexico, but it also didn't feel like we got to fully explore that. I really liked the parallels of looking at society and the social structures of Mexico versus England and London, and those were not, you know, overt in the sense of we were being told them, and I thought that that was incredibly successful, and I thought we could have pushed that even further, especially with this idea of Gabby's father trying to marry her off again and pull the full emotional weight of that, have a little bit more of that conflict, and I think it was just kind of refining, or a matter of refining what we already have. Like, did Gabby or would Gabby have something in her stakes of what she was wanting or fighting for? And we see little blips of it with the charity work she does and kind of touring, something that she would have been interested in relation to charity work in Mexico. And so then kind of facing down the potential of this marriage, but we also don't get to know really any of these gentlemen that her father is considering for her. We see them as these just kind of shapes, essentially, that Gabby is reckoning with. And so, again, the full stakes of things are never fully realized, and the characterizations of these individuals are great. I understand these archetypes. I understand the baggage they're bringing to the table and the potential in them meeting together and what each of them can draw out of the other. And I don't know that we're fully allowed to explore that because we pulled our punches emotionally with these characters and we didn't allow them to be fully messy at the end of the day. I think Gabby could have been a little messier, a little bit more reactive to Sebastian in some ways. And I don't say that like I wanted her to be mean to him, but I think that there was an opportunity for her to be fully vulnerable with him. And I think that's where this was the most successful, those moments of vulnerability. And we got them a little bit in terms of emotional breakdown, which I don't begrudge because I do love a comfort moment in my romance novels. But I think that there was this opportunity for both of them to kind of unmask to a certain degree with each other, that we didn't get to feel that full emotional kind of unburdening, that full emotional messiness, like I say, which is often related to the stakes or can be tied back to the stakes in terms of that. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be angsty or overwrought. We just need to get to the emotional truth of it. And Sebastian's ultimate emotional truth felt a little disconnected. It ended up kind of tying back to some family stuff that led to him keeping a secret from Gabby, which didn't feel like what made sense for them as a couple in terms of their obstacles at the end of the day for me. And I don't know how I feel about that. I didn't hate it. I didn't love it. It just felt a little bit non sequitur. The intimate scenes were steamy, which was kind of ironic because right before all hell kind of broke loose. I had written in my reading journal as of page 213, a hand flex is kind of where we were sitting, and we had this kind of real slow burn. And then we went 0 to 60 very quickly. And while we didn't, again, see the full realization of that line that was planted early, we did get some of it. And I think that too, we had these moments that were clearly set up as like these emotional precursors that I wanted to see fully grappled with and realized. I wanted to like turn in on themselves in that way, and just the satisfaction of that. And I think it was attempted. I think that it didn't fully succeed for me personally, but it almost got there. And so the instinct though was right on. But I think too with that, again, going back to kind of this idea of the emotional realizations and then the callbacks, when we're looking especially at Sebastian with that kind of twist in the third act, not really circling back to the kind of grappling with his privilege. And we see it a little bit, and we also see him use his privilege to Gabby's benefit in certain scenarios. But I think that there was even more opportunity there, even if I did find those moments very satisfying, as we had another drawing room kind of cut down and power flex scene that was also satisfying for me. Again, I like the way that Liana de la Rosa sets up a social barb. I did also really enjoy the time we spent in Mexico. Again, I would have liked to see even more of that, but I think I'm just so thirsty for different settings. And again, I think the parallelism that was explored there was really excellent as well. And so I don't want to leave you thinking that I did not enjoy my reading time of this book. I absolutely did. Again, I just, as with all of the books, I can see the opportunity to like catapult it into a realm of my favorites that isn't fully realized while I still enjoy my time. And I just want to see that catapulting, because we're just like right on the edge of it. There's so many good pieces set up that I think we could really explore even deeper. And that is part of why I am devastated that Liana de la Rosa, I don't think, is currently contracted for any more historicals at the moment. At least I feel like that's what I've heard through the grapevine, which really upsets me, because I want to see where she would or will continue to go from here within historical. I do think that there is a freshness to her voice in the space that I really appreciate. I think at the end of the day, this book falls in between Isabel and Anna for me. So I think for me personally, my ranking of this trilogy would go Isabel and the Rogue. I am a sucker for a wallflower and spying. I am who I am. Then Gabby, and then Anna Maria. Mostly because of those pacing issues, because Anna Maria and Gideon were like prime couple for me in potential. I loved all of these couples. All of these couples really worked. And it's interesting because originally I wanted Isabel with Sebastian when we got a glimpse of them in Anna Maria. And then I saw the vision. I was like, yes, I understand this idea of Sebastian and Gabby being able to meet each other where they are in terms of that sparring and that kind of emotional matching. And I think too with Gabby, this idea that as she's kind of had to present herself within a certain context in society, as she has served a certain role within her family and what that has meant for her, I wanted her to have that emotional release that she has with Sebastian. And they do reference, or it's referenced in the narrative at times, even once they, are to a different understanding between each other. The banter is part of the appeal, but again, we're hearing about that like through montage rather than really getting to experience it fully. But again, the vision is so good, and just a little more glasses appreciation for the road. But those are my kind of overarching, slightly messy thoughts about Gabriela and Sebastian in Gabriela and His Grace. And if you've read this book, I would love to hear your thoughts. If you've read any of the series, I would love to hear your thoughts. As always, thank you for hanging out and listening to mine. If you've made it this far, leave a pink flower below in the comments if you don't have anything else to say, or if there's not a pink flower, a pink heart, because I don't know my emoji keyboard well enough. But like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good. And yeah, bye.